Okay, brilliant. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, respected colleagues and guests. My name is Hannah Aisha. This month's colloquium is entitled An Ummatic Approach to Refugee Ethics. It's unfortunately the case today that the vast majority of refugees stem from Muslim countries. According to Islamic Relief, up to 2/3 of all refugees come from just 5 states: Syria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar, and Somalia. Muslim states are also among the largest hosts of refugee populations, with Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey ranking highly following the fallout of the Arab Spring in the last decade, but also states further afield, such as Sudan and Mauritania. Added to this, the Muslim world is intimately connected to one of the largest and most protracted refugee crises, that of the Palestinians, now in its 75th year. Despite the varied and disproportionate ways in which Muslims are affected by refugee flows, these challenges are still exclusively addressed within the framework of the nation-state paradigm. Yet by virtue of being co-religionists, one may question whether a different set of principles and ethics stemming from our faith could govern our interaction with this problem. This is exactly the question addressed in a recent paper published in the Journal of International Humanitarian Action, Umma and the Nation-State, Dilemmas in Refuge Ethics, by Dr. Hossam El Din Mohammed and Dr. Rajai Jureidini. Their paper addresses the concept of the Umma in the context of the contemporary debates and policies around refugees and their rights in the Muslim world. They examine the extent to which Muslim-majority nation-states have undermined Muslim unity and solidarity through their policies and political priorities. Finally, they consider how these states can better address the ongoing refugee crises using Islamic ethics, laws, and Ummatic principles. While these are invoked in principle, they are not always evident in practice. Are refugee policies applied by Muslim-majority countries today in accordance with the fundamental Islamic teachings and experiences of the original Hijrah? To what extent can policies in Muslim-majority countries be developed and enhanced in the light of Ummatic principles that might alleviate the long-standing refugee crises in this troubled area of the world? We're very grateful to have both Dr. Hossam and Dr. Ray to consent to present to us their paper today. Dr. Hossam El Din Mohammed is a professor of Islamic Studies at Karabuk University in Turkey. He was formerly a professor at the College of Islamic Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar. He has held research and teaching positions at the University of Oxford and North Minzu University in China. He has authored several books on Islamic jurisprudence and financial contracts, as well as numerous journal articles on Islamic constitutional reform, political thought, and Islamic ethics. Dr. Rajai Jureidini is a professor of migration, human rights, and ethics at the College of Islamic Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University, and in the first of its kind Master of Arts programs in Applied Islamic Ethics. He is the founder and editor of the Journal of Arabic, Islamic, and Middle East Studies, and has taught at universities in Australia, Lebanon, Egypt, and was formerly the director for the Center of Migration and Refugee Studies at the American University of Cairo. He is the author of Migrant Labour Recruitment to Qatar, published in 2014 by Bloomsbury, and a co-editor of the forthcoming Migration and Islamic Ethics, published by Brill Publishers. We're also lucky to have 2 respondents join us today. First, we have Dr. Sol Takahashi, who is a professor of human rights and peace studies at Osaka Hoaquin University in Osaka, Japan. A former UN civil servant, he lived in Palestine for 2 years as deputy head of the Office of the UN Human Rights Agency, where he was responsible for directing the human rights monitoring operations in the West Bank and Gaza. Dr. Takahashi is the author of several books in both English and Japanese on human rights, state security, and international law. And last but by no means least, we have our second respondent for today, Dr. Kamal Funshu Badruddin. Dr. Kamal completed his PhD at Al-Azhar University from the Faculty of Law and Sharia. He is currently a common law and Sharia researcher at the University of Abuja in Nigeria, and he is also the editor-in-chief of aboutislam.net. So alhamdulillah, I'm very excited for our conversation ahead today with our very international panel. After the presentations, we will have our usual Q&A session. You can submit questions to the speakers directly during the Q&A box throughout the event, but we also encourage people to make use of the general chat box to share their thoughts on the presentations during the lectures. Please also look out for our regular polls to share your thoughts on what the speakers are discussing. We'll first head to both Dr. Hossam and Dr. Ray to present their paper, and then over to our two respondents. So without further ado, Dr. Hossam, I believe you're going first. I'll come over to you. The floor is yours.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. First of all, I would like to begin by thanking Sister Hannah Aisha and Prof. Waimir for this gracious invitation to present the paper today. I would also like to extend my gratitude to Prof. Soul and Prof. Kamal for taking time to read the paper and provide a valuable contribution to this important discussion. Assuming everybody or many of us read the paper, I will concentrate only on the overall theme of the paper. And also, I will try to attach more to the ultimate goal of this seminar today, curriculum. So today, we would like to bring attention to one of the most tragic and aggravating disaster of our time. I mean the disaster of refugees. According to statistics, around 70% of the world's refugees are Muslims, and the majority of them come from just 5 countries, as Aisha mentioned: Syria, Palestine, Myanmar, Somalia, and Afghanistan. These refugees are primarily hosted by neighboring Muslim countries, Turkey, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Jordan, while some non-Muslim countries have received refugees, such as Germany. Other, like the USA, Canada, and Australia, have relatively taken few. The primary cause of the refugee crisis is the increasing number of civil wars and armed conflicts that have doubled in the past decade, indeed tripled in the past decade, forcing ordinary people to flee their homes. However, a significant proportion of refugees who are resettled in Islamic countries live under miserable circumstances. They are at risk of unlawful deportation, exploitation, including sexual exploitation, and face difficulties in accessing basic rights such as healthcare, education, housing, and work. This is partially because most of the host countries are less developed countries. They lack the financial resources to support refugees. These countries, indeed, still to bear more than 84% of the refugee financial cost without receiving adequate support from other countries. This situation leads many refugees to continue the treacherous journey to Europe to save their lives. This is rightly stated by Guterres. He said, thousands of refugees' parents risk their children's lives on unsafe smuggling boats, primarily because they have no other choice. On the other hand, wealthy Gulf states, this is another reality, seem to be existed in another area of the earth. Wealthy Gulf states enjoy levels or high levels of GDP, strong infrastructure, and the capacity of incorporate migrants have been accused of taking zero refugees. Critics didn't consider that these countries are not signatories of the UN refugees conventions, or they have already donated a substantial amount of money to support refugee camps. These difficult situations brings us to think deeply about the Umma and try to find an Ummatic approach to refugee ethics. We wonder if Muslim Ummah was operating today, would people from Muslim countries in crisis be compelled to risk their lives to seek refuge in Europe? Our articles, therefore, aims to raise the following questions and provide some insights into potential answers. First, we examine the existence of the Ummah under the contemporary circumstances and discuss the extent to which the nation state has undermined the principles of Muslim unity and solidarity beyond national borders. Second, we look at how much Islamic fundamental teaching of mutual assistance and the experiences of original hijrah have been invoked in refugee policies to alleviate the crisis. We see this in principles, but not always in practice. So have these principles have been made redundant by the secular culture of modern nation states? And finally, we explore the potential for policies in Muslim majority countries to be developed and enhanced in light of the Ummah principles to alleviate the crisis. We also consider whether the recent innovation of UNHCR Zakat Fund represents an Ummatic manifestation that can be developed and built on. This is actually assuming some level of Ummatic concern in refugee practices. To answer these inquiries, the article is comprised of 3 sections. The first provides a theoretical and sociological analysis of the concept of the Ummah as an inclusive entity that encompasses both Muslims and non-Muslims who share the same cultural and ethical values and live with the Muslims in the abode of Islam. This in contrast with modern nation state, which is viewed as exclusive political institution, was created by, as known, by colonial powers, and has resulted in competition, encouraging competition and conflict between the countries in the Middle East and the other regions. We suggested that the obsessive tendency of modern nation states is a hindrance, a big hindrance to development of a cohesive international community, just as it is against attachment to Ummah as a global community of Muslims. Therefore, we call for a pressing need for introducing a new paradigm of modern nation state that integrates the Ummah idea to ease the suffering of refugees. This reform will address economic and political problems and ultimately benefit the regions. The second section examines the refugees policies of 3 Muslim majority countries that have played a significant role in hosting refugees in the past decade. I mean Jordan, Bangladesh, and Turkey. We seek to understand the extent to which these policies are based upon Ummatic principles or secularist notions of national interest. We found, although there is no official Ummatic refugee policy in these 3 countries, but there are some one sees can offer hope. For example, Turkey and Jordan have granted citizenship to large numbers of refugees. These 3 countries have invoked occasionally Ummatic symbolism on the level of political decision in accepting refugees. Interestingly, also, Turkey has supported Rohingya outside of its territory by more than $60 million. Despite these nuances, these three countries, like other Muslim majority countries, have non-integrated policy, which only offers temporary refuge within their territories. In this sense, we assume that Umma needs to be translated into modern application that can mitigate the negative effects of nation states on refugees. Here, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, I mean OIC, as the largest international organization and the only religious-political organization in the world today, is invited to play a pivotal role to elevate the crisis of refugees and to produce an ummatic manifestation. The final section highlights the recent innovation of the UNHCR Zakat Fund as a manifestation of the Ummah, which has proven honorable and viable. And now I will stop here and invite my dear colleague, my co-author, Prof. Ray, to provide more elaborated details on the last sections and conclusion. And thank you for attention, and we look forward to an engaging discussion. Prof. Ray, please, the floor is yours. Ray.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Hossam. Okay, I'm just going to, and thank you very much for the organizers. Thank you, Aisha, and everybody for allowing us to do a presentation at this colloquium. I'm just going to share my screen now for the PowerPoint. So I'm just going to focus now on the UNHCR Refugee Zakat Fund and provide some details that were covered in the paper, but also some criticisms that were not in the paper, and then invite for discussion. How do I? Here we are. So, where do I put this? Okay. So there are various estimates of the actual and potential of zakat funds in the aggregate. Between Sturk provides a rather large gap. Hello? Sorry.
It's okay. Go ahead. Carry on, Dr. Ray.
So between 200 billion and 1 trillion annually worldwide, Ali Al-Qaradari said $100 billion was coming annually just from the GCC states, $5.7 billion annually from Indonesia, Malaysia, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. And the Professor Noor from the World Zakat Waqf Forum says that there's a potential for something like 20 or $21 billion coming from Indonesia alone. So these are very large potential funds. The first Zakat initiative was introduced by UNHCR as a pilot program in September 2016, partnering with the UAE nonprofit Tabaf Foundation. In April 2019, the initiative was transformed into the Refugee Zakat Fund. Sorry. to, quote, help individuals and Islamic financial institutions to realize their social responsibility with global impact. The scheme was backed by Islamic scholars and fatwas to tap into Islamic charitable giving in the face of declining UN resources. At the time, there was over 70 million forced displaced persons globally, persons of concern to the UNHCR, and has been said before, 60% from the Organization of Islamic Cooperation countries. There are now approximately 100 million if we include the Ukrainian refugees. The fund initially sought to address the needs of mainly displaced Muslims in states that were not signatories to the 1951 Refugee Convention, namely Jordan, Lebanon, Bangladesh, Malaysia, and Iraq, and the signatory states of Egypt, Yemen, and Mauritania. It was deemed to be a pragmatic distribution solution for the Zakat Fund to use a UN human rights institution with a global infrastructure to reach Muslim refugees. The 2016-18 pilot phase had some 34,000 beneficiaries, both refugees and IDPs, that is, internally displaced persons. In 2019, the first year of the Refugee Zakat Fund, there were over 1 million beneficiaries distributing just over $43 million US dollars. And more than 90% of this came from Muslim foundations and charities, primarily the GCC, who themselves chose the destination countries for their contributions. And we'll come to this some more later on. In 2020, the second year of the fund, it received $61.5 million, and the beneficiaries were over 1.6 million in Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, Egypt, Mauritania, Niger, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. It's worth noting here, as we noted in the paper, that initially Sheikh Thani bin Abdullah bin Thani Al Thani made what was for the UNHCR a record individual contribution of $35 million in 2019 in support of the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh and displaced Yemenis. Approximately 875,000 Rohingya refugees and Yemeni IDPs and returnees were supported from this contribution. In 2020, again, his humanitarian fund gave more than 43 million and directed to support the most vulnerable, internally displaced and host community families in Yemen, as well as refugees in Lebanon, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Chad. So we need to keep that in mind, that there was this massive individual donation to the fund initially. Now, Zakat for refugees as an Ummatic act is an important aspect of the paper. So from an Islamic perspective, donating and giving zakat and other forms of charitable giving is not only a religious act, but its function is also to serve social solidarity among Muslims as in the Ummah. For example, Qasim and Tawadi used the case of Indonesian assistance to the Rohingya to argue that the idea of zakat to finance Muslim refugees was to, quote, strengthen the obligations to protect the Rohingya refugees as solidarity among fellow Muslims. Similarly, Durbali suggests that the International Zakat Fund aims to promote concepts such as justice and social equality, as well as solidarity and mutual aid. Now, the Kuwait's Zakat House policy states that it, quote, aims to strengthen the solidarity and interdependence of all Muslim people who actually constitute one Ummah, despite the remoteness of their countries of residence. And emphasizing the practicalities of using the aid infrastructure of UNHCR, it's argued that faith-based organizations should lead the way while capitalizing on strategic and sustainable partnerships with multilateral organizations based on an effective and impact-oriented approach, and build a sense of solidarity with their host Muslim brothers and sisters. Thus, it's argued that the UNHCR Refugee Zakat Fund can be located firmly within the Muslim ethical framework of the Ummah. In establishing the fund, UNHCR had to agree to uphold three principles as laid out in the 5 main fatwas that modified the organization's normal operations. Firstly, that the recipients must be one of the 8 eligibility categories as stated in the Quran. In reality, most what came under the 5 categories of the poor, the needy, the indebted, stranded travelers, and those in bondage. All funds must be distributed without deductions for administration overheads. This is a massive concession by UNHCR. And that all the donations should be in cash, either bank transfers or hard currency whenever feasible, and which was deemed to be a more dignified means of support and facilitating better monitoring. And this is something that's new and part of ongoing debates. And a note here that these arrangements are donor-centric, with the added proviso that the destination of the funds is decided by the zakat donor or partner at the onset of the partnership. By 2021, UNHCR claimed to be a trusted, compliant, and effective distributor, harnessing the power of zakat to transform the lives of refugees. The fund is subject to rigorous governance, ensuring transparency at every step from donation to distribution of zakat funds to eligible families. And this is the process. I don't think I have time to go through all of that, but there is a very rigorous process of selection of eligible families and protections in the actual distribution of the funds. I can come back to that again if you need me to. By 2020, the Islamic finance banks provided automatic accounts deductions for zakat. Blockchain technology now enables zakat tracking from donor to recipient. And by the end of 2020, UNHCR launched the first official zakat mobile app called Give Zakat, the most prominent feature being real-time reporting on zakat funds received online, in addition to a tracking tab allowing users to trace their zakat donations until they reach the beneficiary families. Is the Muslim exclusivity of donations and recipients an issue of discrimination? These are now some of the ethical issues that are raised. It is the religious basis of both the donation and beneficiary acceptance of zakat that suggests the need for an exclusive Muslim-to-Muslim charity, that is, requiring discrimination. A quote here from Kidwai and Zidani: while collection and payment of zakat are an act of faith, it's best led by agencies that are able to affirm the faith and build structures to ensure zakat funds are managed with due regard. When this is done with a sound social welfare strategy founded upon scripture, this could help enhance impact, reduce cost, and improve reach. My question here then is it appropriate, therefore, that a non-Muslim institution like UNHCR be allowed to handle Muslim charity funds? The majority opinion is that zakat cannot be given to non-Muslims, but there is a well-argued and supported minority opinion based on the Hanafi ruling upheld by other eminent scholars that zakat al-fitr can be given to people of the book, namely Christians, Jews, and Muslims, and those analogous to them. Based on this, it's held that zakat may be paid to the poor of the people of the book, provided that, firstly, the prior right of the Muslim poor and needy to the zakat wealth paid by Muslim rich alone is not impaired or curtailed in any way by this. And secondly, that the poor of the people of the book to whom this excess zakat is paid do no harm to Muslims or to the religion of Islam. That's taken from the Zakat Foundation report. And perhaps the clearest guidance is articulated by the National Zakat Foundation in England, where it's argued that the majority of scholars agree that zakat is to be paid and received by Muslims only. Here it's suggested that because zakat is a religious obligation, this and the many other rules and regulations applied to zakat are deemed to be directed to Muslims exclusively. On the other hand, other acts of charity by Muslims do not have the same rules and restrictions. Voluntary charity like sadaqah, for example, can be donated to anyone and in any form without prioritizing cash. Hence, we encourage Muslims to also spend as much sadaqah as possible to help both Muslims and non-Muslims, whether poor or not, in whatever form possible. Now, arguments against the UNHCR Refugee Zakat Fund, here we see a tension between the idea of cash donations, which is a sort of arm's length charity, versus face-to-face charity by allowing refugees to enter the country and to protect them. Dr. Sultan Barakat, in a recent seminar at Hamad bin Khalifa University, said that giving cash does not address the often shocking conditions that refugees live under, such as insecure camps in northern Syria. And perhaps cash contributions are in fact best suited to urban refugees rather than those in remote camps. Urban refugees, of course, can access bank accounts and so on. And all of the so-called benefits of cash contributions are more accessible to them rather than in actual refugee camps. And he also argued, why should zakat be given to a Western institution to manage? And Dr. Sari Hanafi, in an article in a special issue of Sociology of Islam, argued that the politics of pity has replaced compassion, empathy, and justice. This is the Gulf's response to the refugee crisis. That is, the state and society donations in the Gulf comforted the conscience of the Gulf citizens and statesmen with relatively small numbers of hosted refugees. Pity, he argued, as a social convention occurs at a distance, while compassion takes place when the person not suffering is in front of the person who is suffering.
Dr. Ray, we've got about sort of 3 to 4 minutes, if you could wrap up.
Yes, I can do that. So let me just, this is from the World Zakat Waqf Forum in Indonesia, where it was argued in a September 2022 conference that they strongly reject this UNHCR policy on the zakat. They expect all of their 41 member countries to reject the policy, that the UN should stop the UNHCR zakat collection immediately, that the UN should seek its funding sources without disturbing the funding of zakat and waqf, which is for the benefit of Muslims. They argued that the United Nations is not a zakat organization. It is an unsupervised activity. There is a huge possibility for the occurrence of irregularities, meaning corruption, and that the funds should be distributed among the poor in the country of donor origin rather than worldwide, and that the potential of zakat and waqf is also to strengthen the country's fiscal policy. Well, if you like, I can leave it there. Dr. Hossam already made some remarks about the conclusion. So we can revisit it if required. So I'm sorry to have taken so much time. Thank you.
No, not at all. You're right on time. That's great, inshallah. And perhaps we can come back after the respondents to get some of your thoughts on the issues that they may raise. But thank you so much for starting off the conversation. If you can press stop share, that's perfect, brilliant. Okay, so let's come then to our first respondent, Dr. Saul. There we go. The floor is yours.
Right, thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I just so everybody listening does not get the wrong idea, I'm not in Jerusalem anymore. I was here for 5 years, as has already been said. I was the deputy head of the UN Human Rights Agency in occupied Palestine. So that's what I was doing, and I've left the UN so I can be completely frank and open about any kind of international issue that I want, which is very refreshing and nice. And now I'm teaching at a very small women's university in Osaka. I'm an international human rights lawyer. That's really what I do. But of course, I have a very personal and strong personal interest in Ummatic issues, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity. I've done just a little bit of writing myself, actually, on this kind of issue about how the Umma can address refugee issues in a more proper way, in a more effective, religiously proper, and basically in a more effective way. I think one of the things that I've been looking at and didn't really come up in your paper, and I'd be very interested in getting your thoughts about, is the question of citizenship. I've sort of looked at this issue a little bit from that angle, and I started off my career as a refugee lawyer. In actual fact, I started off my career in Amnesty International in Japan and then in London, and I was assisting individual refugee claimants, and that's basically how I got started out in human rights. And the countries in which I worked in were mainly state parties to the 51 Refugee Convention. Some of them weren't. I've also I also covered Turkey, and Turkey is always a sort of little bit of a gray zone there. But one of the things which from that experience that has always struck me is that, no matter how much we talk about refugee protection, it will never be as good as the protection that a state is expected to give to its citizens, and that's that's how it's envisioned in the Refugee Convention. I mean, states are required to give certain elements of protection to refugees, and they're supposed to do certain things, and it even says that the host state should facilitate the acquisition of citizenship by refugees, but it's second best. I mean, it's never going to be as good. And I've always I feel that one of the key issues of Umma might be citizenship, joint citizenship. And I'm thinking, of course, I look at, for example, the European Union, and the European Union, of course, is not there yet. I mean, there's no international organization really that has truly joint citizenship. I mean, you're a citizen of Austria or France or Germany, you remain a citizen of that particular country. But the states of the European Union have ceded a huge amount of sovereignty to the collective. And it seems to me, I mean, I see it's indisputable in my mind. It's not linear, but it definitely the European Union is progressing towards some sort of concept of joint citizenship. And with joint citizenship, of course, comes freedom of movement. I mean, freedom of movement is, of course, one of the main key issues here. So I'm interested, I'd be very interested in hearing both of your perspectives on that. What I'm saying is that if the Ummah were to have joint citizenship, then the question of refugee protection would almost be moot. Because it's you move to another country within the Ummah just as a citizen of that country, just as, for example, an Italian would move to France, and you would have you enjoy all the same rights and all the same duties in that other country as well. So, of course, this is not something which is going to happen in 5 years or 10 years' time. And inshallah, perhaps it'll happen in our lifetime. Let's see. But I'm curious as to what your perspective and your both of your opinion on that. The other thing I was very interested in is your. I think in your paper you put forward the OIC as one of the prospective vehicles towards providing better protection, better Ummatic protection for refugees. As a former UN civil servant myself, of course, I'm of two minds about this. And I say that because for example, with the United Nations, I mean, I worked there for a long time, and I'm very aware of the shortcomings and of the deficiencies of the United Nations. At the same time, when it comes to replacing the United Nations, then it opens a whole other sort of can of worms, and so we almost inevitably people we all sort of fall back to saying, well, this is the best we've got. And I sort of have that. I'm of two minds about what you wrote in the paper, because I sort of feel that way about the OIC. I mean, the deficiencies of the OIC and the general sort of shortcomings are something I don't think we need to sort of go rehash them here, because I think everybody, has a pretty good idea of them. But at the same time, it is what it is what we've got, and maybe from a practical sense, it makes more sense to continue working within the framework of the OIC to improve it. But again, I'm of two minds of that, and I'm sort of interested in what you think about that. Finally, with the Zakat Fund, it certainly is I think it's a very exciting development, frankly. And certainly, like you rightly pointed out, I mean, the fact that, for example, HCR is not allowed to take overhead, I mean, that is a big deal for a UN agency, I will tell you right now. That the donations have to be cash, again, a big deal. And this is, having worked in humanitarian issues, this is something which has been subject to a lot of debate, the kind of donations that must be, given to refugees. How can this work, and all that kind of thing. So a big deal, and frankly, I think a big step in terms of progress. One thing about the Zakat Fund that I have seen is that, like you rightly pointed out, it's donor centric, i.e. the donor says, this should go to that country, this should go to that country. My money, I'm giving you my money on the basis of the understanding that you're going to use this on that country situation. And I've always, I've always believed that is the real problem. That's with the United Nations as a whole. Now, I'm not talking about the Zakat Fund in particular, just with the United Nations as a whole, because what we call earmarked donations have really made the United Nations into a prisoner, basically a prisoner of the well-to-do countries and of their priorities. Of course, with the Zakat Fund, there is a requirement of using it only on Muslims, so that that danger becomes a little bit less. But still, I do believe there's a danger of donations going to the situations which are in the TV screens. Yes, there are TV screens, and not perhaps the international, the other so-called international media TV screens, but there's still the TV screens. And I think there is that kind of danger. So finally, I'd be interested in your perspective on that, on those issues. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sol. You raised some really interesting questions there. And based on some of those thoughts, we will be launching a poll for our audience in the next few minutes. So keep an eye out for that. But for the moment, we'll come to our second respondent, Dr. Kamal. Can you hear us, Dr. Kamal?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. I've been trying to fix the issue of my camera, but I can see it's still there is something technically speaking behind it. So my apology if that is not going to be an issue. If you can hear me perfectly.
No problem. No problem.
I'm very glad to be with you, and Jazakumullah khairan, Sister Aisha, for getting us up together for this interesting topic. The topic of migration is very, very important, and it's hotly debated issue, as you know. It has imposed itself on the international community from quite a long time ago, and has since topped the list of agenda of many countries. In addition to always being a very sensitive issue to every one of us, be you an expert or professionals or thinkers. So international issue of migration refugee is always on top of the agenda on different panels. So it's a very important issue, and I commend the efforts of Professor Mohammed and Jureidini. They did an excellent job in presenting useful information with detailed facts and figures about this topic. I truly commend the effort. The fact that migrants and refugees from the Muslim world top the list, this is a very, very important point that I noticed in your presentation, and I want to start with that. The fact that migrants and refugees from Muslim world top the list of the global migrants is a worrisome issue that has attracted the attention of many experts and researchers since quite a long time ago. I remember the statement made by, I think it was Dr. Abdul Aziz Jureidini, if I'm not mistaken, the Secretary General of the Islamic Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, I think SESCO. He made that statement in 2005 at the International Conference on Migration and Religion, conference held in Rabat in December 2005. What did he say? He made it clear that the organization was paying due attention to the issue of migration, given the fact that he himself noticed that it's the worrisome fact that Muslim migrants or migration from Muslim countries, the number of migration refugees from Muslim countries top the list of global migration. So as I look at this presentation, it reminds me of my own research and study, which I presented for my PhD program at Rajai University in 2019. So it's really gladdens my heart to be part of this panel. First of all, one of the things that triggered my attention and the reason for this topic when I choose it for my PhD program was that protection of migrants, that is the title of my research, protection of migrants or human rights of migrants, is that I noticed that there was a prevailing misconception associated with the issue of migration, which been always viewed as a problem. Migration has been always viewed as a problem or disaster, and migrants being portrayed, refugees in particular, as unwelcome guests, and at times they have been portrayed as enemies of the state or enemies of the state. That is why I see it very, very important that whenever we want to address this issue, we should tackle it from the angle of the linkage between migration and human rights. Because I believe those two topics, they are very linked together. Both international law of human rights and international humanitarian law. And they are those in two areas, those two topics are really, really attached together. And we should look at it from this perspective, trying to figure it out. How do they work together in parallel under the auspices of human rights international, under the auspices of international human rights law and the international humanitarian law. This is because there is always a conflict between state sovereignty and the human rights of foreigners, especially the migrants and refugees. So I'm glad that this angle has been greatly attended to by Professor Jureidini Mohammed and given a deserved attention in the presentation. I'm really glad to see that. So to both of you, I say Jazakumullah khairan. There is no doubt that the human rights law plays an important role in reshaping the mechanisms of migration control, as it is clear that a lack of human rights-based migration control is a driving motor to gross violations being perpetrated against migrants, violations of human rights, violation of their dignity, and so on and so forth, as we witness almost on daily basis. Whether you talk about migrants in transit, or even migrants in their country of origin, or even when they reach their destination countries, you see lots of violation of human rights being perpetrated against them. For instance, we all remember what happened during the so-called desperate journey. I think that is still ringing in our memories now. Desperate journey was the name, it was a media name, by the way, given to the upsurge of migrants and refugees from the Middle East when they embarked in thousands. They embarked on the journey towards Europe. I think that was as a result of the so-called Arab Spring. So we're all noting how the international community reacted to the issue at the time. There is no doubt that such a pitiful episode in the issue of mankind points to one particular point, which is very important. It points to the failure of the contemporary restrictive migration and border policies adopted by modern nation states in reaction to the migration issue. Instead, or rather meeting up with the objectives, because there is a certain objective for which this approach or this policy was designed. But instead of meeting up with this objective, what happened? These policies have certainly led to many other problems, such as increasing the level of poverty, widening the gap between rich and poor nations. It has also led to human trafficking on a wider scale, as we all know, as well as increasing the vulnerability of undocumented migrants. So in discussing migration and human rights, in my own perspective, certain questions that I consider very important need to be answered. So one of these questions is, we really need to shed light on the status of the person called refugee. Who is a refugee or is a migrant? I know, of course, we're all aware because we're all experts. I know that we can use any of those two terms. We're talking about refugee or migrant, although refugee is different from ordinary migrant, because refugee is a person who is subject to a forced migration from his own country. But both of them, they fall under larger framework of migration. So we really need to ask the question, who is migrant or who is a refugee in terms of human being? Who is he or who is she? Does a person have a right to migrate in the first place? And if it does, if we say the answer is yes, how does that right fall in line with the rights of states? And when you talk about state here, we can underline it. I mean, both the country of origin, the country of transit, the country of destination, because we all know there are certain rights that those modern states, they are given by the international law as part of their inalienable rights for being states. So how does the right of a refugee, if we believe he has a right, how does that right fall in line with that state? So And I think, if I may say, I think in your presentation, you try to share light on some of these issues, some of these, to answer some of these questions. So, but I would have loved to see the answer in details because really it's very, very important. So I know there's an attempt, as I said. Maybe that can come up later, or maybe that can be given another opportunity within the scope of the new research. So, but the issue of women and modern state, which, as you said, there are two opposing concepts at play. A concept of Umma is quite different from that of modern state, which is based on the rights and duties agreed upon and stipulated in the Montevideo Convention, 1933. So, and we are talking about entities with defined borders, independent political community and people. So, in a nutshell, I believe that without addressing the human rights of migrants, it will be difficult for us to encompass all the issues, all the problems, to address all the problems and challenges facing these vulnerable people, because they are put in a kind of direct confrontation between them and states, between them and countries on a daily basis. And even when the international community rises up to look into this crisis and to try to address these problems, we know what happened when they were just only looking. We know the evolution of international human rights, international law, when it first started, that individual did not even possess any status. Then gradually this changed after the Second World War with the adoption of the United Nations Charter. So we know for all these things, something that we are all aware of. But even with that said, what has this enhanced status of individual in the highest of national law? What has it earned refugee or migrant?
Dr. Kamal, if you could just wrap up in the next couple of minutes.
Okay, sorry.
No,
so
no problem.
We're just trying to say that we really need to have a linkage between these two very, very important dimensions, in my opinion. Then let me quickly go to some of the points you raised in your presentation, which I consider very, very important. You mentioned secular religious dynamics, where there is a constant connection between secular and religious in a way that improves the humanitarian response to disasters. This is a very good point, in my opinion, as it strengthens the argument that there is always a common ground between religions. And when I talk about religions, I mean Islam in particular, which is Sharia teachings and principles, and non-Islamic legal system, to collaborate in addressing problems, be they social problems, economic, or whatever, because I believe they can be given a kind of a platform to address all these problems that are important to humanity in general. The other point that you mentioned is that you said that you talk about nation state versus Umma. I would like just only to talk briefly on that, because this tendency intensified in the colonial period, as you mentioned, where the nation state became a force against the development of a cohesive international community, just as it turned against an attachment to the Umma as a group. In this regard, we can talk about nationalism. We can talk about contradiction between modern nation state and the Umma to 3 fields. You mentioned 3 fields: nationalism, territoriality, and sovereignty. To me, these are the most relevant to making sense of the refugee crisis from an ethical perspective. To me, not only ethical perspective, it is both historical and legal perspectives. Because what I consider most important at this junction is the legal aspect. As such, and every one of these elements constitutes a legal basis for the restrictive policies adopted by modern states against migration. There is a link between migration policy and the state structure as well as the commission criteria. I'm talking here about nationality, talking also about sovereignty, also about territoriality. Those three elements are the core foundation of what we see today as the policies of restriction being adopted against migration. And lastly, I'm glad that my first respondent mentioned an important point about citizenship, which I also consider, because citizenship is one of these three elements. It's part of nationality. And I believe that without addressing this issue of citizenship, it might be difficult for us to have a comprehensive view about the crisis of refugees in today's world. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to further discussion.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Kamal. Thank you so much for offering some of your thoughts there. On that note, I think we'll progress onto our Q&A session, inshallah. As always, we ask people to keep their comments somewhat brief, between up to about 2 minutes long. But I think for the moment, actually, let's start with Dr. Ray. Dr. Hossam, would you be interested in coming back on some of the points raised by Dr. Sol and Dr. Kamal? Oh, I think you're muted, Dr. Hossam. Yeah. Oh, both of you.
Yes. Okay. Dr. Hossam, go ahead.
Dr. Hossam, you're muted. I think you. I've requested you to unmute. Yes, we can hear you.
Can you unmute him?
Yes, he's unmuted now. Dr. Hossam, go ahead.
No, I invited. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, okay. I want to Ray to start, because I started. I began first, and actually I would like to revere my dear colleague to start first. So let him start first.
Okay. All right. Okay, I'll try and be as brief as I can, but you've raised, thank you so much for these commentaries, and you raised some very, very good issues. I'm not sure if I can do justice to them, but Dr. Saul, the issue of citizenship is a very important one. But of course, as you know, citizenship is only really seriously entertained in resettlement programs with countries that are actually accepting refugees for resettlement. Countries of first asylum don't normally do that. And we see in recent decades the number of refugees who are being resettled and therefore given a chance to really change their lives entirely and get citizenship and permanency and protection are few and far between. They're very, very small numbers compared to the number of refugees requiring that level of protection. And we also see, for example, I think it's true that one of the main reasons why the GCC states did not sign the 51 Refugee Convention was in fact because citizenship was expected in resettlement. And as you know, these states, because of their oil wealth, oil and gas wealth, do not want to freely offer citizenship to non-citizens. So I also agree with you with regard to being in two minds about the OIC. And again, I think you're quite right to say, well, that's been done quite a lot and doesn't need to be revisited here. The issue of donor centrism, I'm not quite sure. I mean, I certainly understood what you were saying about the earmarking donations and so on. But in a way, the ability to earmark recipients of donors or donations may be a good thing because it may, in fact, provide more donations than people just donating in universalistic way and not really knowing or sometimes even trusting that their donations are going to be received by the people that that really need it. So what I think is really interesting with this Zakat fund is that the donor knows exactly where their donations are going, can direct it there, and there is transparency through the technology that it can now be used that wasn't there before. And I think that's a really very, very interesting development. With regard to Dr. Kamal's commentary, I must confess, I didn't really, the sound quality coming from him was not too good, and I didn't really catch everything that he said. But one of the things that I picked up on was that he wanted some light shed on who is a refugee and who is a migrant. This is a big issue. The debate between the debate of what was called the migration refugee nexus that was developed at Oxford University in the Refugee Studies program still haunts us today. But the UNHCR is very clear in distinguishing between a refugee and a migrant. And one of the key elements of that is that the refugee cannot return home. And that's the key factor that distinguishes a refugee from a migrant. Even though the migrant may be seeking a better economic conditions for their future, they are not, they don't have a well-founded fear of persecution as defines the refugee. And they're very, very clear about that because there is international law that provides for protection for refugees as so defined and in fact registered by the UNHCR, except for situations where like the Syrians, for example, were given prima facie refugee status without the need for individual status determination interviews and so on and so forth. The debate goes on, and there were some really tragic situations in Europe where Germany, for example, just decided that Afghans were safe to go home and so would not accept them as refugees while they were stranded, in various European countries trying to get to Germany to find work. And the issue of work is also extremely important. And this is where the Zakat Fund really is comes into its own, because in so many countries of transit, for example, refugees are not allowed to work. So how are they going to be supported? The kinds of support that and funds that UNHCR has had are really very small. And the Zakat Fund can really provide tremendous support where refugees cannot work and do not have livelihoods. So that is also something that needs to be highlighted. Anyway, so I'll leave it there, but we could talk a lot more about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ray, for bringing up those thoughts. It's interesting that you bring up, sorry, Dr. Hossam, would you like to come in first?
Yes, sure.
Yes, go ahead.
Regarding the issue of citizenship, one of the main aspects that I have thought a lot when I wrote this paper, the issue of citizenship, because as it is well known, the modern nation state grants citizenship without any discrimination between its citizens. The important questions here is the Umma like this, so grants citizenship as modern nation states. From my point of view, based on many evidence and historical sources, I can say yes. There are many evidence examples of starting from a city constitution, Medina constitution, Medina Shart, Sahifat al-Medina, which Jews and polytheists and peoples are considered as one Ummah. They have also during the historical period of the Ummah, all scholars unanimously agreed that all minorities in the abode of Islam are members of abode of Islam. So they have rights and obligations such as Muslims. Maybe there are some nuances between Muslims and non-Muslims as the political levels, the highest political levels, due to some specific requirements for who leads this country, this state, or this ummah. But except the higher position of government, like Khalifa or like the president, there are many open positions for non-Muslims, and the history confirms this. Many of non-Muslims held higher positions in Islamic states. So the issue of citizenship in Ummah is not different than modern nation states. Actually, it's not different between modern nation state and Ummah from this perspective, and we can accommodate all people who live in the state, the Ummah, as equal citizens without any differentiation. Actually, especially now we have constitutions which determine very clearly the obligations and the rights of everyone. So I believe the issue of citizenship is not a big issue, and it's not a big aspect of debate today if we think from the religious and historical perspective. This is about the citizenship issue. Regarding Dr. Kamal, I thank him very much, but unfortunately, the quality of voice, as Ray mentioned, was not good, and I couldn't hear much of his said. So, inshallah, maybe he can raise his questions directly. Inshallah, we can.
Yes, feel free as well, Dr. Kamal. We heard a little bit of what you were saying, but I think it was a little bit muffled at points. You can, inshallah, highlight some of your main points in the chat box as well, inshallah, and people can take a look at what it is you were saying. I mean, you kind of answered in part the question that I was going to put to you, Dr. Hossam and Dr. Ray, based on our poll results with respect to the we ran a couple of polls as everybody was speaking. The first was on the UNHCR Zakat fund, and whether this should be the responsibility of the UN, or whether there are alternatives needed. And there were some mixed responses. I think some people were content with the UN taking responsibility of this. Others thought that Muslim countries ought to have that responsibility, and some thought that we need independent agencies or charities. You did raise, Dr. Ray, some of the contentions that people highlight with respect to this argument, but in your conclusion, you almost highlighted that some of those contentions perhaps don't stand up to scrutiny. What is your opinion on UNHCR, being in control of this fund and distributing it?
Well, I mean, I see that the use of the UNHCR was a very pragmatic arrangement, because of the infrastructure that they have throughout the world to assist refugees. So it was a means of distribution, and the conditions under which the Zakat fund was to be established I think was unprecedented for the UNHCR. The question is, what better organization probably doesn't exist, but may be formed if under for example, an Ummatic leadership and headline and an institution, but that still needs to be established. I would have thought that the kind of massive funds that are potentially available through zakat and other forms of Muslim charitable donations, that kind of infrastructure that UNHCR currently has could be actually developed specifically for Muslims. But I don't see that happening at this point, partly because Muslim charities historically, at least since 9/11, have been under tremendous scrutiny and attack because of accusations, whether true or false, of money laundering and so on and so forth, which has prevented them from doing the good works that they were originally established for. And so there is this wider international and political context that has to be taken into account. UNHCR is already there. It is an accepted UN organization. But then again, UN, how effective is the UN these days? There's a tremendous attacks on the credibility of United Nations instrumentalities, etc. And so everything's highly problematic. But I think that this is something that seems to be working, and it's still a drop in the ocean, it seems to me. And as long as there is Muslim oversight on this, which there is, then it should be fine. It's not as if UNHCR, all the personnel within UNHCR are Westerners. That's not the case. So we need to look perhaps more closely at the management of the organization for the Zakat Fund. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
no, it does, absolutely. No, thank you very much for sort of sharing your thoughts on that. I'm keen to bring in anybody else who has any particular opinion on that. Either Dr. Saul, Dr. Anjum.
Can you hear?
Yes, Dr. Kamal, we can try again. Let's see if
quite unfortunate that you said most of what I said, you guys could not hear it. So I'm still sad within that, because I thought that the audio was perfect before I started my presentation.
It's cutting in and out, but at first it was better, but I think it's cutting in and out. We could hear the gist of it, but I think not perhaps the specifics.
Up to now?
I think it's fairly similar now. I'm going to suggest that perhaps you write in the chat box perhaps your comment, and we can read it out, inshallah, just to make sure that we're hearing it in full this time.
Okay, I will do that.
Okay, inshallah. Dr. Anjum, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody. I really learned a lot from both the presentation and the comments. And it raises an interesting question I wanted to ask, particularly following up on Dr. Ray's comment about the possibility of an Ummatic mandate to distribute funds to refugees. What do you see as, what kind of obstacles do you think that such a mandate, such an organization would face? Is it possible, given, of course, the political situation and the Muslim nation states are extremely wary of any kind of empowerment of civil society? Would that be a main obstacle, the political fear that the governments might have of their people? Or are there other perhaps possibilities? Are there any examples of existing institutions? Could could some of the relief organizations be perhaps empowered to fulfill this function? It seems that these relief organizations do tremendous work. Could they be empowered? What would be chief obstacles in allowing relief organizations to work across borders? And this is a question for anybody, but particularly Dr. Ray and perhaps Dr. Saul as well.
Do you want me to?
Yes, yes, go ahead, Dr. Ray. Start us off and then we'll come to Dr. Saul.
Okay. Look, I think that it raises so many issues, the political context. First of all, I would have thought that the establishment of charitable funds within Muslim majority states is nowhere near as problematic as Muslim charities in non-Muslim states. And then there's the other issue of currency and the distribution of these funds. Excuse me. And we know that the incredible power that the American dollar has, and that the movement of money between countries, goes through the United States. It's been a long time, and any challenges to that get short shrift from the United States. So there are those issues about the transferring of funds, and much care has to be taken to make sure that money is not being creamed off because of currency exchanges and so on and so forth going through the US. Maybe Dr. Saul can elaborate on that. I'm sure he knows more than I do about those sorts of transfers, but that's what needs to be done, and it's a very complex process. But I think that what we have here in the Zakat, the UNHCR Zakat Fund for refugees, is a relatively clean kind of structure and distribution mechanism that probably it doesn't face those limitations and surveillance that other forms of charitable transactions in other states, well, across the world, rather. Sorry, I'll leave it there. My voice is.
Oh dear.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
May I, if I could just jump in and add a few words? Yes, thank you. Actually, I don't really have that much to add to what Professor Jureidini, you've already been saying. I think the location of the Zakat Fund within UNHCR, like you said, is a pragmatic way forward, or was a pragmatic way forward, and it certainly seems to me to make sense. I mean, first of all, from the practical point of view, of course, UNHCR has organizational overreach. It has organizational capacity within the UN system. It is certainly the organization that has the best reputation for getting things done, if you like. There are problems, don't get me wrong, and sometimes they're addressed and sometimes they're not, but there are these kind of it's the organization that can actually do this kind of thing, certainly within the UN system. Outside the UN system, I really can't think of any organization that in the immediate term could handle something like this. And that's from the practical point of view, and also from the political point of view, which Professor Jureidini, you were also mentioning. It's having creating a separate organization that specializes in Ummatic issues and the distribution of Zakat funds. Us creating this kind of organization would, that I can see that operating with relative relatively less stress in Muslim countries. But of course, as we all see, many Muslim refugees are in countries which are not predominantly Muslim countries. And then we open a whole sort of can of worms and we see a lot of issues. I can see how that would be a problem. Whereas with the UN, for all its faults, is the universal organization that we have. And when they say, okay, there's a refugee emergency in country A, we really need to get in there and provide humanitarian aid, that country A will do its best to negotiate something and put pressure on UNHCR to do some, to sort of modify the way it does things so that it benefits country A. But at the end of the day, it's going to say yes. I mean, it's very, very difficult for it to shut out UNHCR and UN organizations in general. So, in that way, I think it is actually quite a pragmatic and a good way forward right here, right now. In the future, maybe we could create some kind of different organization that would specialize on this, operating for Muslim refugees. Maybe that is one of the ways forward. But certainly right here, right now, it's I think it would be politically very, very difficult to do.
Could I ask a follow-up question? In fact, it's a slightly different question, but now that I have you here and given your interest in Palestine, one of the other thoughts is that how Palestinian refugees are typically treated in neighboring Arab countries. Part of the logic for never giving them citizenship and never giving them equal rights, never, in fact, and I may be wrong, maybe correct me, but never almost accepting them is that, well, if they become too comfortable, A, they will compete with our citizens, B, perhaps they have foreign agendas, and C, well, they might not want to go back. So the pressure on for them to return to their homes will disappear, and governments want to use that politically. So in other words, there is always a deliberate creation of second-class and really uncomfortable status by neighboring Muslim countries for these refugees, almost with justifications that are all benevolent. That, well, we're doing it for you. Do you see that? And is there an outcry against it? Is it a legitimate logic that these people, in fact, will fare worse if they're treated well? Is there any discourse on that?
Well, thank you. Well, there is certainly a lot of discourse on it. The Palestinian refugees, of course, the Palestinian refugee issue is a whole different category under international law, for better or for worse. And Palestinian, if you look at the 1951 Refugee Convention, it says specifically, basically, it specifically excludes Palestinian refugees. And the sort of justification, if you like, at the time when they were creating this convention was that, well, Palestinian refugees, we've created a whole different agency for them, i.e. UNRWA, a relief and works agency. And so, they're set, we're providing assistance for them. The issue will be sorted out pretty soon anyway. It's not gonna last too long. And we've created a specific agency for them anyway. So they're fine, they're sorted. In fact, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but the 1951 was actually created really only with the situation of Europe in mind. 1951 actually excludes anybody outside of Europe. That geographical limitation was removed later on in a different a subsequent international instrument. But the point is that the Palestinian refugees are completely excluded. And one of the key injustices that the Palestinian people and Palestinian refugees in particular face under this is that UNHCR, who looks after all the other refugees in the world except Palestinian refugees, at least in the neighboring countries, UNHCR has a protection mandate. It has a mandate not only to provide assistance, humanitarian assistance, but also to protect refugees, i.e. we have this population of, refugees are people who cannot return to their own country. Their country is unable and unwilling to provide them with the protection that under international law they're supposed to do to their citizens. So, we have this unprotected population, and the UNHCR sets in and provides what we call surrogate protection for refugees. It doesn't always work, and there are a lot of issues with all of this, but in practice. But the point is, that's what UNHCR exists to do. And there is this tension with the UNHCR. There has been for decades about, are we primarily a humanitarian agency, or are we a human rights / protection agency? This has been going on, and it continues. But the point is, it's part of the mandate. UNRWA does not have that. UNRWA only provides assistance to Palestinian refugees, full stop. It doesn't have the kind of human rights protection mandate that UNHCR does. Of course, people who work at UNRWA, they're there on the ground, and they see the terrible things that, Palestinian refugees face, both within Palestine and also in neighboring countries. And so, they try to do their best to be vocal and active in trying to promote the rights of Palestinian refugees. But there's always this line, this gray line, which is very difficult for them to cross. It can be very, very politically dangerous for them to go too far. And they have these kind of constraints that UNHCR does not. So with Palestinian refugees, they're in a much more vulnerable position than other refugees, despite what the Israelis say, of course, which is that, oh well, they have their own agency, so they've got it made. They get special treatment. So what are they complaining about, et cetera, et cetera? That's nonsense. I mean, the fact of the matter is, Palestinian refugees are excluded from the system of protection, and that makes them much more vulnerable. Thanks. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, Alhamdulillah, Dr. Kamal has shared some thoughts in the chat box, and he also has raised one question which I was going to come to as well. I think the second, one of the other crux of this conversation has been this issue to do with citizenship. And I think a couple of the professors talked about this idea, I think it was you as well, Dr. Saul, about universal citizenship. That is, and Dr. Kamal writes, this is put forward by some in the context of looking for an effective solution to the crisis of refugees. Does that somehow rhyme with the notion of an Ummatic framework? And obviously, given the focus of the project and the platform that we're speaking on today, moving forward, I guess, how can we use an Ummatic framework to understand and conceptualize this notion of expanding citizenship or rethinking citizenship?
May I? Should I?
Yes.
Okay, yes. Okay, thank you.
No,
well, this is exactly what.
Go around.
No, okay, thank you. I mean, this is exactly what I was trying to say. I mean, I think what we should be looking for, or I'm just sort of throwing this out there, but what I've written on a little bit is the need exactly to conceptualize citizenship in a different way, in a sort of transnational way, so that we have a citizenship of the Umma. And at least within, for a Muslim refugee in a predominantly Muslim country, another part of the Umma, then that would be able to provide effective protection. If you're a refugee, then you're a refugee. You're the citizen of your country. As a refugee, you are entitled to certain rights and certain protections, but you're never a citizen. You never attain that level until you get citizenship of the host country, with a sort of pan Umma citizenship, if you like. I think that problem is obviated. Obviously, that doesn't deal with the issue of Muslim refugees in non-Muslim countries. That's for sure. But I do think it's a step forward, not just for this, but just for all sorts of other things. To when we're thinking about solidarity and togetherness and the one community nature of the whole thing. I think this pan-Ummatic citizenship is something that is worth looking at. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Hossam, would you like to come in?
Sure. I think the idea of citizenship in the framework of the Ummah depends on the idea of the citizenship as a meaning which gathers the people together in the specific specific area with specific goals. From this perspective, we think how can citizenship can be work in the framework of the Ummah, because it is depends on the shared community of the Ummah. So it is not, I think it is not big difference between modern nation states and the Ummah from this perspective, because all share the same rights and same obligations in this this Ummah or state or this political entity. So if we consider this, the citizenship is about meaning of belonging and attachment to political or social meaning or political meaning, then the Ummah is not different than modern nation state from this perspective. Actually, we need to think for, as Dr. Sol mentioned, for new interpretation for citizenship. If we only read the traditional religious text, maybe it is very difficult to understand. But if we look at the crux of the meaning of citizenship, about it's the belonging to the state or belonging to the Ummah or the political entity, then there is no big difference between Ummah and the nation state from this perspective. Anybody can be granted the citizenship in the Ummah as can be granted the citizenship in the modern nation states. No difference. Wallahu a'lam.
Would anybody else like to share their thoughts on that, on the notion of an Ummatic citizenship, either from our panelists or our attendees in the comments? Dr. Ray, feel free to come in.
I was just thinking as Dr. Hossam was talking that one of the rather disturbing developments recently has been the rise of fascism, which is very much tied to the nation state and is very much a part of the nation state, a very negative one, as we see occurring in Italy, for example, and in many countries in Europe and so on. And that's something that has to be guarded against, I think. The idea that the exclusivity and the demonization of non-members of a nation state, etc. So just a thought.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something that has been disturbingly on the rise everywhere and definitely affects how people would see their notions of citizenship. Okay, having said that, okay, Dr. Kamal has raised a few other interesting points in the webinar, but on this issue of citizenship, Zain Ahmed writes, how do we prevent an Ummatic citizenship from being compared to Israeli citizenship, for instance? The fact that obviously, you know, all Jews are eligible for Israeli citizenship. Perhaps, yeah, this is being touched on right now. Anybody have any comment on that? Dr. Sol, I think that might particularly resonate with you given your experience.
This is a tough one. But in a way, there probably are similarities. I mean, I do think that there could be. I mean, obviously the historical circumstances are a little bit different in that at the time there was no predominantly Jewish state, whereas now we have predominantly Muslim modern nation states. So historically, of course, it's a little bit different, but in a way there are probably similarities because it would be, I mean, in the way that I'm sort of thinking about it, a citizenship, or at least a claim to citizenship, a right to citizenship that would transcend national boundaries or the boundaries of what is the modern nation state. So in a way, it's a little bit, excuse me, it's a little bit similar. Of course, this Israeli citizenship is dodgy on a whole, all sorts of different levels, because it's really about ethnicity and not about religious devotion or religious faith, which is one of the key sort of paradoxes of the whole Zionist, philosophy. Judaism used to be a religion. It was a religion just like Islam and just like Christianity. But at a certain point, it was racialized, mainly by Europeans. And it became an ethnic and racial thing. And the state of Israel has essentially, taken that on and continues on with it. Because to have the right to Israeli citizenship, basically all you need to do is to show that you have a certain amount of Jewish blood in you. It is possible, theoretically, to sort of to convert to Judaism and become an Israeli citizen. It's theoretically possible, but it's very, very difficult as far as I understand, and as a practical matter, almost impossible. But I think there are definitely similarities. It's not the kind of thing that I would want to say, we should think about it in those terms, but there are definitely similarities, I think.
Okay, interesting. We're coming towards the end of the session now, so anybody who has any further comments to make, feel free to raise your hands. But otherwise, I think I'll touch a little bit on two related points, one by Dr. Kamal that he left in the comments, and one that was submitted in the Q&A box, which is the role of Islamic jurisprudence in all of this and Islamic history. Dr. Kamal writes that Islamic jurisprudence is not absolutely against the issue of territoriality or the notion of defined borders as a security measure and protection for the state. In fact, this was practiced somehow in the first Islamic state in Medina. Perhaps we need to highlight this so that people don't have a misconceived understanding that Muslims are clamoring for something that is not practical, especially in today's reality. And I feel like this is somewhat related to a question submitted by Zain Ahmed of what was done in the early period of Islam when a non-Muslim was living in a Muslim land was in need. And I think that if anybody has any reflections to share just in general on the Sahifa of Medina has already been mentioned, but how some of the ethics that we see in Islamic history are relevant to the situation we're looking at today. Dr. Hossam, I'm not sure if you've unmuted or, Dr. Anjem, go ahead.
So I'll take a quick stab at it. I've worked on the Sahifa of Medina and on Islamic history. And in general, non-Muslims could live in Darul Islam either as dhimmis, which is basically dhimmatud is a legal status. And although the notion of citizenship did not exist, but it was a legal status of certain rights and duties. But the Sahifa of Medina, on the other hand, something that I've worked on, it is my thesis that it is often historically misrepresented by Muslim reformists to turn it into something like a constitution. It wasn't. It was much more of a, it was concluded at the time of the Prophet ﷺ did not have anything approaching sovereignty in Medina, and therefore it is not a full charter of rights and duties of citizens and belonging. It was rather a limited deal. In fact, the most of the main Jewish tribes are not even named in it, and many of its sections are abrogated in later verses in the Quran, and some are, a number of them are reiterated. So I've worked on this, and part of it is available at the Yaqeen Institute article, and some is forthcoming. But to your question of what would a non-Muslim in need in the Muslim lands in Darul Islam would receive, well, there is actually room for that in Baytul Mal charity, what could become something like, Social Security or pension or whatnot. All of that applies to dhimmis just as it applies to non-Muslims. The question of zakah, however, is different, and the question, and for the vast majority of Muslim scholars, zakah goes only to Muslims, although there are exceptions, and I think that those exceptions could take into account dhimmis, whereas in non-Muslim lands, where as Muslims in the West, those are conditions where it wouldn't apply. But charity, sadaqah in general, as well as zakat al-fitr, could go to non-Muslims. But we have precedent in the famous incident of Caliph Umar, when he saw non-Muslims, dhimmis, an old dhimmi, really emaciated and weak and old. He appointed a stipend for him, so there is a specific precedent for a state pension, one might say, in modern jargon, for non-Muslims.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Anjem. Does anybody else want to come in on that or share any other final thoughts before I think we're heading towards wrapping up now?
Okay, one thing
Sorry,
about
Oh, okay. Sorry, go ahead, Dr. Hassan. We'll come back straight back to you, Dr. Kamal.
regarding the territoriality or the nationalism or sovereignty, Dr. Kamal mentioned this is the Islamic jurisprudence is not against especially something like territoriality, for example, but we should think about the borders or security borders, which these borders not as geographical lines, When we talk about refugees, it's not a geographical lines to determine the geographical area for a specific state. These borders used to be obstacles among any influx of refugees, whatever their need to enter the state. The borders stands as a big obstacles to prevent influx and flows from refugees, even though they are in dire need. This is, I think, this is in Islamic jurisprudence is not allowed. It's not allowed, not for only for Muslims, but only for all. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Quran, وَإِنْ أَحَدٌ مِنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ اسْتَجَارَكَ فَأَجِرْهُ حَتَّى يَسْمَعَ كَلَامَ اللَّهِ ثُمَّ أَبْلِغْهُ مَأْمَنَهُ. Anybody asked you the protection and the refuge, give him this refuge until he reaches the safe place. So if we talk about the borders, to prevent people to stand as a big obstacles in front of refugees, to prevent refugees, like what happened in Rohingya, when they stuck between Bangladesh and Malaysia, called land for no man, I think. This is in Islamic jurisprudence. It is forbidden. It is not allowed. So, according to the practical, if this is practical, yes, practical, yes. Why not? We see EU, for example, they managed to open their borders for their citizens. Umma during 1,400 years, all people from any fictions or from any faction or from any religion can move from one place to other freely without any obstacles. So I think when we come to Islamic jurisprudence, we should to think about what nationalism and sovereignty and territoriality represent as impacts on the refugees in our time.
Thank you, Dr. Hossam. It's a really
If I
relevant.
may comment.
Go ahead. Yes, Dr. Kamal, go ahead.
Yeah, if I may comment. Thank you, Professor Jureidini, if I'm not mistaken. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I believe so. I think it's, Dr. Ray is still struggling a little bit. It might be easier with video to as well hear what you're saying.
Okay. Yeah, I understand perfectly where you are coming from. My postulation was mainly just to put things in proper perspective so that people will not understand that Islamic international policy, when it comes to, international relations, was just for an open-ended policy, like open borders, so that people, at least as a state, it doesn't have its own restriction policy or restrictive agenda when it comes to, and it's not just only a border of Islamic states, it's always open. Everybody can come in. To me, I think that is not the correct interpretation of what took place even in the first Muslim state established in Medina. There were some instances in the Islamic history where some, especially during the time of Caliph Umar, when some people were prevented from entering Medina based upon certain political wisdom of the Khalifa at that time. Although maybe we can say that before, something as a default principle was that when it comes to humanitarian reasons or humanitarian program, Islam or Islamic State does not have to sign some sort of what we witness today as a closed border, just as what happened during the desperate journey of 2005. That was my point.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Kamal. I think we had more now compared to last time, alhamdulillah. And thank you again for sharing your thoughts. However, we are coming up to the top of the hour, so if there are no further final comments from anybody, we may just, inshallah, end it here.
I'll just say a couple of final words. I think that.
Okay, go ahead, Dr. Anjem.
Yeah, sorry, I told you earlier that I didn't have anything, but I wanted to just, first of all, thank everyone who presented here. Thank you very much, especially Dr. Kamal. I know it was difficult for you in terms of technology, and we would have learned a lot more from you had we understood you as we understood at the end. But I'm so glad that you stuck around with us. Thank you very much. Also to Dr. Ray and Dr. Hossam. And it was a real pleasure also to get to know Dr. Saul and his expertise. I'm sure that we'll be benefiting more from it in the future as we think about the Ummatic mandate toward Muslim refugees. I wanted to, in fact, just invite everyone who hasn't registered or visited our website, ummatics.org, to please do so. Make sure that you hear about our events, our future colloquia, and we are open to colloquium presentations. If you're interested in writing about something or responding, please reach out to myself or Hannah, Hassan, or any of us. And also we have our first annual conference on the issue of the nation state and the beyond the nation state, our first annual conference in June, mid-June in Istanbul. If any of you are going to be around, please let us know, and we'll make sure to extend an invitation to you in Istanbul. And beyond that, please stay in touch. And it was wonderful to see you all. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Thank you, Dr. Anjum. You've done my job for me. Inshallah, everybody, as Dr. Anjum said, keep an eye on our social media channels for our upcoming events. I think they've been put into the chat box now for you. And inshallah, we will see you at our future events. Please subscribe to our newsletter if you have not already. And inshallah, we hope to see you again soon. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Thank you very much.
Salam.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.